Okay, so before we get into what is chapter 31 of the book of Numbers, I want to provide a little bit of background. 31 really deals with a holy war, the war of the Israelites against the Midianites. And I think it's important to sort of think about warfare in general in ancient times and Jewish warfare, Israelite warfare. So in general, the tradition distinguishes between two kinds of war. What's called milchemet mitzvah, which is a mitzvah war, a war that we can say God commands, and milchemet reshut, which is a war which you may or may not engage in. Right? You're not forced to do it, but in antiquity, people made war all the time. They made war for territory. It was there's this statement in the book of Samuel talking about David, which prefaces something that happens in the book of Samuel simply by saying, in the season when kings go to war, right? That there would be a season of warfare as people tried to conquer each other. This is a model, I have to say, that we see right now. This is, if you look at what Russia is doing, it follows an ancient model, right, which is a war of conquest. The Torah does not forbid wars of conquest, but it does put strong limitations on them, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But they are in the category of a war which is permissible, but not commanded. So a commanded war is milchemet mitzvah, a war which is a mitzvah, and then a permissible war, though one is not obliged to do it, is called milchemet reshut. At any rate, in general, when we think about warfare, and this is not the obligatory war, not the mitzvah war, but the others, there are really strong limits on, I'm looking, I want to, if you're not wholly dressed, please turn off your camera. Unfortunately, I don't have a way to edit that out of the tape, or I would, out of the recording. Anyway, if it's a milchemet reshut, if it's a war which you choose to prosecute, then there are rules. So, and there are a lot of military exemptions for those who would choose not to participate. In fact, those who are not allowed to participate. So, for example, and you'll find these in Deuteronomy in chapter 20, for example, a person who has just built a house, but hasn't had the opportunity to live in it, or planted a vineyard, but not had the opportunity to harvest the fruit and to make wine, or someone who is engaged and not actually had the opportunity to marry, all those people are automatically exempted, lest they die in a war and never get to enjoy the house that they built or the vineyard, or in fact, to marry the woman that they want to marry. Beyond that, there are specific laws about how you proceed with warfare in this kind of a war. Again, not an obligatory war. The first thing you have to do is to offer peace.
For that, there is one headline.
Offer people the opportunity to.
The president does not know whether the Supreme Court.
You need to mute everybody, Rabbi.
Yeah, I'm going to try to mute everybody. That's exactly what I'm going to try to do.
Another, and this was back a little more than 20. Then
looking for it. I am looking. Oh, here, mute all. Okay. All right. I've muted everybody. I'll unmute you when the time comes to respond. I can't turn off anyone's camera, but at least I can mute you. Okay. So laws of warfare. First of all, you have to offer the people that you are, the nation you're about to attack, the opportunity to make peace. Secondly, there are laws on what you can do in warfare. You're not allowed to rape. The Torah is very clear about that. You can take women captive, and if you want to engage them sexually, you have to first give them time to mourn their losses in the war, and then you marry them, right? So there's no sense in which you can rape a woman in warfare. And interestingly enough, I think if you're sieging a city, you can't cut down its fruit trees in the process of sieging it. There is a sense in which we want to avoid ecological disaster. You have to think about the period after the war, and people are going to be hungry. And this law about not cutting down fruit trees becomes the basis, in fact, for Jewish environmentalism, right? This sense that one has to preserve the environment. And it's also the basis of a law called Bal Tashchit, which means you shouldn't waste resources, and much more broadly than just fruit trees in war. So there's a lot of legislation, but I have to say that all that legislation does not apply to the kind of war that we are going to look at, the war against the Midianites, which is a mitzvah war. In general, only the wars commanded in the Torah fall into that category. God has to explicitly say, go conquer the land, or go fight against Amalek, or go and fight the Midianites, as we're about to see. Other than that, it's a reshoot, with one exception, according to Maimonides. This is not a biblical exception, but Maimonides says that a war of self-defense is a mitzvah war, right? One that you have no choice but to pursue. And I think he derives this from the general sense that you can and must fight to save yourself. And so he makes that exception. One other thing that I want to say about a war which is a mitzvah is that the rabbis essentially abolish it. They don't see any basis beyond the Torah for doing it. And they point to it, they do it technically, which is the way the Talmudic rabbis generally do these things when they want to create, say that a law is a dead letter, right? And so they say, since there are no kings in Israel, and since there is no longer a Sanhedrin, the body and the individual, right? Sanhedrin was this ruling court made of 70 individuals. Since both of them had been abolished, the kingship and the Sanhedrin, no one had the right to pronounce a war a mitzvah war, right? Because the Torah is done, right? God is not sending us prophets to tell us to go fight. By the time of the rabbis, there is no more prophecy. The Torah commands about warfare are done, and the rabbis simply say, it's a dead letter, and essentially abolish this idea of a mitzvah war. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I am going to open things up for a moment to gallery here. And if anyone has a question about warfare, Myra, go ahead. I can't hear, everybody is now.
I had to unmute myself.
You did.
Well, but what about during the Holocaust? Suppose
Right.
that they had an army in Poland, whatever, Jews had an army, and they could fight against the Nazis and maybe hopefully defeat them or not. Wouldn't that be a mitzvah war?
Yeah, and that's exactly what Maimonides would say. War of self-defense is a mitzvah war.
But you said that the rabbis sort of said there's no.
Right. But the rabbis on technical grounds end it. But Maimonides, who comes later, right? Well after the Talmud, in the sense, just as the rabbis understand the Torah in a particular way, Maimonides now comes to revise that view. And there are other authorities who didn't agree, by the way. But Maimonides, and this has become really, it becomes a hot issue in Israel today, where you have an army. And what extent can you, so for example, can you bomb Iran, right? You could easily say it's self-defense. It's necessary. They're going to destroy us. That would be a mitzvah, according to Maimonides, right? Others would say no, right? They can't go that far. You might or might not do it, but you're not obligated to do it. And that, but if you think about the Holocaust, there's really no question in terms of that. The justification that Israel used during the 6-day war, right? And I think rightly, was that it was they started it. They did, but it was a defensive war. It was clear that they were going to be attacked and they wanted to prevent it, or at least they couldn't prevent it, but they could, strike the first blow. Maimonides would say that was the right thing to do. In fact, it was a mitzvah to do what they did. But the rabbis, there's a mitzvah, I guess you could say there's a mitzvah and a mitzvah, right? One is that you are obliged to protect yourself. And it's a little bit different from saying God commands you to do it. Well, it depends how you're using the word mitzvah in a way. You're obligated. That seems clear. And the word mitzvah is an obligation. You're obligated to do it. But is God telling you to do it? Are those two things synonymous? You could argue that Maimonides is not saying that God's telling you, but he is saying that you're obligated. Or perhaps not. Maybe he does think that God is telling you. I just raise it as a possibility. I really don't know. Yeah, Saul. Unmute, please.
The wars against the 7 nations, Hachiti, Ha'amori, they were wars of mitzvah.
Those
right?
are mitzvah wars, right?
Okay.
They are specifically commanded. The war against Midian, which we're going to look at, is not like the wars against the 7 nations, which are wars of conquest, right? This is a war which is a kind of war of retribution. And I'm going to talk about that when we look at the text itself, right? So it is a milchemet mitzvah, mitzvah war, but it's not included in the wars of conquest, just as the obligation to fight against the Amalekites is not included in the wars of contest. Okay, and those are that probably is an exhaustive list, right? The war against the 7 nations to conquer the land, the war against the Amalekites, and the war against the Midianites. Okay, you also have wars of, as the Israelites are marching through, you have wars of self-defense, right, where they are attacked, and as we saw, for example, with when Og comes out with his army and attacks them, and they have to fight back. Okay, so we are looking now, and we'll get into the text with that background. We are looking at chapter 31 in the book of Numbers. We're going to start at the very beginning, which is on page 943. And God speaks to Moses, and now in verse 2. He says, Nikom nikmat b'nei Yisrael. Here, the translation is avenge the Israelite people. But if you look at the note here, right, and that's note on verse 2, just the bottom of the page, avenge on Hebrew nikom means redress past war wrongs from. Translating as avenge has no basis in scripture. when the subject is God. Fight, but the idea here is that this is redress, this is payback for a wrong that was done. And we're going to see that the wrong was done both to the Israelites themselves, and a different wrong has been done to God. So, redress the wrong, the people of Israel on the Midianites, and then you will be gathered to your kin. That is to say, Moses, this Moses is the last act in your leadership of the people. Now, it will turn out that that's not quite true. This will be Moses's last action in a way as a commander, but we have the entire book of Deuteronomy ahead of us, right? And Moses's last act is this extraordinary speech, which takes up the entire book of Deuteronomy, which recapitulates the history of the Jewish people, which provides all kinds of laws, right? So Moses is not done yet, but this is his last sort of official act as commander-in-chief. Joshua will be replacing him. Okay, so Moses speaks to the people and he says, let men be picked out from among you for a campaign, and let them fall upon Midian to wreak the Lord's vengeance upon Midian. And here the word vengeance, before I said redress, here we're talking about retribution, God's retribution. So why is it that the Midianites, why is it that you have to fight against the Midianites? And I'm going to come back, but I want to jump ahead to verse 16, where he talks about sparing the women, yet they are the very ones who at the bidding of Balaam induced the Israelites to trespass against the Lord in the matter of Peor, so that the Lord's community was struck by plague. So what did the Midianites do? First, they tried to get Balaam, this prophet, we've read all this, to curse the people. That doesn't work. And now we're told that Balaam had a second plan, and that was seduction. That the Midianite women would seduce the Israelite men, lead them towards the gods of Midian. And this, of course, makes God angry, and there is a plague. And that is what the Israelites are redressing. This enormous loss of life in this plague, which came about through the deliberate seduction of the Israelite men by the Midianite women. Right? So understand that in context, Israel is looking for payback, not because the Midianites killed them directly, but because the Midianites seduced them into a situation where many Israelites were killed. Now, God is seeking retribution for another reason, and that is that the Midianites lead Israel to break their covenant with God and to violate the 10 Commandments and to worship a different God. Now, this image of the woman as a seductress who leads the people astray is an image that's going to come back again and again in the Bible, right? Not in the Torah itself, but later on in the Bible. So, and the classic example, of course, was Jezebel, Izebel in Hebrew, who is actively working, Ahab's wife, who's actively working to, destroy all the Israelite prophets, get the prophets of Baal, who is the Canaanite god, putting them in power. The last remaining Israelite prophet, Elijah, she chases away, and so on, right? So this becomes a kind of a kind of recurring theme. From a modern feminist perspective, it's not so great, I have to say, this idea that women seduce and so on, even though it's only being applied to specific women. If you look at the book of Proverbs, there we see a description of several, actually, of women who are seductive and how one has to keep away from women. And there's this sense in the book of Proverbs, that women are a little dangerous. They're going to lead you astray. Now, I have to say that if you look at the last chapter of the book of Proverbs, you have, the last chapter is Eshet Chayil, right? Is this description of the opposite kind of a woman, a truly righteous and virtuous woman who is to be praised, right? So it's not a one-sided picture by any means. However, it would be, I think, unfair to say that the Torah doesn't view women as potential seductresses and therefore as dangerous. And you can go, I would go a step further and look at the various laws of modesty in the Jewish tradition. Women have to cover their hair. This is not biblical at all. Women should cover their hair. Women should not sing in public, which you see certainly in the Haredi community and the hair covering in the modern Orthodox community. Why? Because men might be led astray and seduced, and their passions will be aroused, and they'll do things that they shouldn't do, right? And the fact that this is women's responsibility, right? Not women should dress the way they want and men should control themselves, right? Is to a certain extent a reflection of the ideas that you see here in the Bible, right? It's not. On the other hand, I would hope that we, move way beyond that in our world, and nowhere inherent in the Jewish tradition does one find, a statement that this is women's essential nature. It's simply something that can happen and one must be protected against it. Okay, so there's going to be a war. God is commanding this war. Moses says, let men be picked from you from among the, picked out for you among the campaign. And the Hebrew is hechaltsu, right? Being picked out. But this is the root of a word that we know in modern Hebrew also, and we're going to see specifically with the 2.5 tribes who don't want to go into the land of Israel, a story which we'll undoubtedly come to next time, if not this time. Hechaltsu is, of course, the root of chalutzim, right? The chalutzim are those who go in first, right? They are the shock troops who are in the prosecution of the war, the first in, right? The chalutzim. And of course, in modern Jewish history, the chalutzim were the first people to resettle the land of Israel, right? And it's lovely because we'll see that the first troops who go to fight for the land of Israel, as we're going to see it arranged here at the end of the book of Numbers, are also chalutzim, right? So there's a wonderful resonance. One wonders, why were they called, these early settlers of the land of Israel, why were they called chalutzim, right? And I think it's certainly got an echo and a resonance here. Okay, so Moses says, let men be picked out from among you for a campaign, let them fall on Midian to wreck the Lord's vengeance, and you shall dispatch on the campaign 1,000 from every one of the tribes. 12,000 shock troops. 1,000 from each tribe were furnished from the divisions of Israel, 12,000 picks for the campaign. Moses dispatches them on the campaign, 1,000 from each tribe, with Pinchas, the son of Eleazar, serving as a priest on the campaign, equipped with sacred utensils and the trumpets for sounding the blast. So it's striking here that it's Pinchas and not Eleazar. Why? Eleazar is, after all, the high priest. And one would expect that it is, if we're going to take this religious stuff, right? And though it talks about, I'm just looking at the language here, the clay kodesh, right? The holy utensils or sacred utensils, and the trumpets, which are also sacred, right? These are things, because this is a religious war, right? Religion is front and center. And based on other passages, one assumes that they're taking the ark with them as well. Though it doesn't specifically mention it here, we have these passages, which, by the way, we quote as part of our service every Shabbat. V'yehi so Aaron, right? When the ark went out, Kuma Adonai, God, rise up and destroy your enemies, right? So this idea that the ark is used accompanies the Israelites in battle as a kind of representation of the divine. Not an idol by any means, but it is, and then we have various clay kodesh, right? Holy, sacred utensils. By the way, you know how the word clay kodesh is used in modern Hebrew? Anybody know? Clay kodesh are rabbis and cantors. People like that are known as the clay kodesh, the holy vessels. Don't really think of it that way. I certainly don't think of it that way, but you can say, who are the clay kodesh at that synagogue? Oh, Rabbi so-and-so and Rabbi so-and-so or Chazan so-and-so, right? So the word here, in this very military sense, is, in modern terms, doesn't have that sense at all. Okay. It's interesting, though, to think, and then I'll leave this point, that rabbis, cantors, the leaders of communities are vessels. That their job is to transmit, to carry something which is really external to them. And there needs to be a certain amount of humility, therefore, associated with those roles. It's not about me, right? You shouldn't have clay kodesh who are arrogant, because they're just vessels. Okay, having said that, they take the field, these 12,000 troops, against Midian as the Lord had commanded Moses, and they are completely successful. They slay every male along with their victims. They slew the kings of Midian, Evi, Rekam, Tsur, Hur, Reba, the 5 kings of Midian, and they also put Bilam to the sword. Right? Bilam, who is still there, he hasn't gone home. He's advising the Midianite kings, and this is, by the way, this is a confederation. This is a tribal confederation from among the Midianites. Just as the Israelites themselves are a tribal confederation, and there are princes among each of the tribes. That's what they mean. They call them here kings, right? Malchei Midian, and among the Israelites, they're called princes. But in other words, the Midianites are subdivided into tribes, family groups, clans, however you want to think about them, and they are completely destroyed. The Israelites took the women, children of the Midianites captive, seized as booty all of their beasts, herds, all of their wealth. They destroyed by fire all the towns where they were settled and their encampments. They gathered the spoil, the booty, man and beast. They brought the captives, the booty, the spoil to Moses, Eleazar the priest, the whole Israelite community at the camp in the steppes of Moab at the Jordan near Jericho, right? So they go out, they fight this war. They are completely victorious. And in fact, there was not a single Israelite killed, as we're going to see in this war. Proof, if you will, that they are God's warriors. God has protected them as they're doing God's bidding. Now we get to a particularly distasteful part of this war. Moses, Eleazar the priest, and all the chieftains of the community came out to meet them. Moses became angry with the commanders of the army, the officers of thousands, of hundreds who had come back. Moses said to them, "You have spared every female." Yet they are the ones who, at the bidding of Bilam, induced the Israelites to trespass against the Lord in the matter of Peor, so that the Lord's community was struck by plague. Therefore, slay every male among the children, and slay every woman who has known a man carnally. Spare every young woman who has not had carnal relations with a man. Right? So this really, and it's striking that Moses acts in anger here. Right? I'll put it there. I don't want to put my mind, myself into Moses's mind, but I would say this is not his greatest moment by any means. It's a little bit strange too, because his point of view is all these women were responsible for seducing the Israelites, bringing the plague upon us, and so on. But how are they supposed to exactly determine which women are virgins and which are not? The Talmud, there's some sort of test the rabbis envision where they come before some of Aaron's garments, and some of them flush red with embarrassment and others don't. The whole thing seems a little odd. And it leads one to wonder just how seriously to take this whole thing. How are they to know? At any rate, maybe I'm just trying to make apologies for a text which I find extremely difficult. Okay, then the warriors are to stay outside the camp for 7 days. Everyone among you or among your captives who has slain a person or touched a corpse shall purify himself on the 3rd and 7th day. You'll purify every cloth, every article of skin, everything made of goat's hair, every object of wood, right? Because contact with the dead is contaminating. Blood has been shed. Even though the people are doing God's bidding, they are still ritually impure. They can't simply come back into the camp. They're kept out of the camp. They have to go through rituals of purification before they can re-enter. Eleazar the priest said to the troops who had taken part in the fighting, "This is the law that God has enjoined upon Moses. Gold and silver, copper, iron, tin, and lead, any article that can withstand fire, you should pass through the fire, and they shall be pure, except they must be purified with the water of lustration. Anything that can't withstand fire, you pass through water." So I want to stop here and leave the grisly business behind to tell you that if you want to know how to kosher things, the rules are here. Right? How do you kosher something? It depends. If it will withstand fire, then you burn it. You put it into fire. Anything that cooks by fire can be koshered by fire. Right? I'm not talking about clay vessels now. I'm talking about utensils, pots, pans, things like that. So if you want to kosher something, you put it in fire. If it won't withstand the fire, what do you use? Use water, boiling water. You're koshering things for Pesach, or something becomes fleshik and you want it to be melchik, or vice versa, or you put the melchik knife into the fleshik pot, right? How do you clean it so that it can be used again? All of that. Ironically, what did the rabbis dig out of all this warfare? Rules for keeping kosher. And how do you keep things kosher? By the way, nowhere here will you find the idea that if you want to kosher a knife, stick it in the ground. This is a very widespread idea that, and there are some sources which suggest it, but by and large, it's not considered to be valid. So if you have there are people I know, they have like gardens of silverware. They've made various mistakes. And the idea is you go stick it in the ground for whatever the length of time is. It's a month, it's a year, I don't really know. Not really valid according to classical halakha, right? You boil it or you burn it. At any rate, on the seventh day, you wash your clothes, you'll be pure and you'll re-enter the camp. And now God says to Moses, what are you going to do with the booty? You and Eleazar, the priest, and the family heads of the community take an inventory of the booty that was captured, man and beast. Very odd statement, because I thought all the men were dead. So how can you have booty that are men if in fact you've killed them all, right? So I want to point out something else, and this comes back to Saul's comment about the wars of conquest. If you look at the book of Joshua, you get the sense from the opening chapters that they go into the land of Israel, they conquer everybody. But as you get into the book, in fact, it doesn't seem to be the case. There are various peoples living in the land of Israel. They didn't actually conquer everybody. And they continue to struggle against people in the land of Israel long after the Israelites are settled in the land. And so it's hard to know what to make of this story, which on the one hand talks about complete annihilation of the men, and now they're sort of their part of the booty available to be enslaved. At any rate, divide the beauty and equally between the combatants who engaged and the rest of the community. So not just the soldiers, but everybody gets to take the booty, and you'll have a levy for the Lord, that God gets God's part, which go to the priests, and then we get a description of how it is to be divided. I'm not going to read every bit of it, but from the half share of the other, you will withhold 1 in every 50 human beings, as well as cattle and animals and so on. And we get a list of all of the sheep and cattle and asses and human beings. And here it says, namely the women who had not had carnal relations being the human beings. But up above, if you look, it says, let me see it, the end of 26. Adam ubehema, men and animals, right? So again, complicated. They divide it up, and the Torah goes on now to explain how, and Moses gives the contribution levied for the Lord to Eleazar the priest. The half share of the other Israelites are take all of these animals, and it goes on. And then we get in verse 49, the commanders of the troop divisions say to Moses, your servants have made a check of the warriors in our charge. Not one is missing, right? Again, this is a war at God's command, and every soldier was victorious and no one dies. It's miraculous. And they bring a very large offering to God, these commanders, in thanksgiving for the fact that none of their troops perish. Okay, and that is the war of the Israelites against the Midianites. I am going to open things up now. Oh, I see I actually left you all on the screen. Anyway, questions or comments, either about warfare in general or this war in particular? Anything at all? Yes, no, Sandy, go ahead, and then Saul.
So Rabbi, the part where it said to kill every woman that have known man by lying with him, but all the women, children that have not known man by lying with him, keep alive for yourselves. Could that just be as simple as kill the married women?
It could be. That would assume that the Midianites are all, chaste, and it's hard to know, since these are people from the point of view of the Torah who were out to seduce Israelite men. Are they the married women who are out there seducing Israelite men, or are they in fact women who are not married? I don't think that the assumption of the Torah is that level of sexual morality that only a married woman would have tried to seduce the Israelites. So I don't think that distinction really can hold. And in fact, from the point of view of the Talmud, there needs to be some kind of test. They can't just say, all right, show us your wedding rings, as it were, right? There needs to be some kind of test. Saul, you were going to say something or ask something?
Yeah, on that
You're-
subject, as a follow-up to that subject, I think what they said here was the women who had sexual relations or were married were killed, and the ones who were not married were spared as booty, right?
Yeah. So, well, the women who didn't have sexual relations. I think the point of the text is, right, that only virgins are spared, and that non-virgins are not synonymous with married women. I don't think it's simply married versus unmarried. It's not the way I read the text. Other comments about this? Okay, so we have just a few minutes left. Let me set up the next section, and then we'll go into it next week. So we have the tribe of Reuven and the tribe of Gad, and they come to Moses. They have a great many cattle, and they look at the land of the Midianites, which they have just conquered, and the Gadites and the Reubenites, that is the people from the tribe of Gad and Reuben, come to Moses and Eleazar the priest and the chieftains of the community, and now they list these territories which had been conquered in the war, right? Atarod and Divan and Yazer and a whole list of them. And they say the land that the Lord has conquered for the community of Israel is cattle country, and we have cattle. It would be a favor to us if this land was given to your servants as a holding. Do not move us across the Jordan. Now, this is really shocking in a way. God promises Abraham that his descendants will inherit the land of Israel. It's all about going from Egypt to Israel in fulfillment of this divine command. And they say, well, we have a lot of cattle, and this is very good land. So why don't we just settle here and not go into the land of Israel? Now we're going to see, and I guess we do have time. We go quickly, I'll come back to it. So what happens, right? What happens? Moses immediately says to them, are your brothers to go to war while you stay here? Why will you turn the minds of Israelites from crossing the land that the Lord has given them? So he says, what, you're going to stay here? Everybody else is going to go in. And not only that, but the fact that you're staying here, other people are not going to want to go fight, right? That is what your fathers did when I sent them from Kadesh Barnea to survey the land. after going up to Wadi Eshkol, surveying the land, they turned their minds of the Israelites from invading the land, right? That's what happened with the scouts. That's why they had to stay in the wilderness for 40 years. You stay here, the people will be discouraged. They won't go into the land. Thereupon the Lord was incensed against the scouts, and he swore, none of the men from 20 years up who came out of Egypt shall see the land that I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They did not remain loyal to me except for Caleb, the son of Yefuneh, and Joshua, the son of Nun. They remained loyal. The Lord was incensed at Israel for 40 years. He made them wander in the wilderness. The whole generation was gone. And now you, a breed of sinful men, have replaced your fathers to add still further to the Lord's wrath. If you turn away from him and he abandons them once more in the wilderness, you will bring calamity on this people, right? So how dare you? How dare you stay here? The people will be discouraged. They won't want to go. They step up and they say to him, we will build sheepfolds for our flocks and towns for our children, and then we will go as chalutzim, right? We'll be in the front in the van of the Israelites until we've established them in their home, while our children stay in the fortified towns because of the inhabitants of the land. We will not return to our homes until every one of the Israelites is in possession of his portion, but we will not have a share with them in the territory beyond the Jordan, for we have received our share on the east side of the Jordan. So what they are proposing here is the first diaspora, right? There is going to be a Jewish settlement, legitimate. Moses is going to say, okay, a legitimate Jewish settlement outside the boundaries of the land of Israel, as it was envisioned. They will fight for the land, but they won't settle it. I find this a remarkable, remarkable passage, because when we talk about the diaspora, we generally think about it as the Jews who were dispersed from the land, who were forced out. When the Babylonians destroyed, fought against the land, and just the Assyrians and the Babylonians, and they were exiled, and then exiled again later on in the year 70. We had this whole community in Babylonia and then in Persia, who were really supposed to be in the land of Israel. And we talked about the exiles coming back and so on, and this notion that Jews are really supposed to be in the land. And yet here, right, there's a great debate between Maimonides and Nachmanides over whether it's a mitzvah to live in the land of Israel at all. Is it a mitzvah? Jews required to do it? Nachmanides says yes, Maimonides says no. But here, from the very beginning, we have the legitimation of Jewish settlement outside the land of Israel, provided what? Provided they fight for the land. Which I think, by the way, I mean, not to get too sermonic, it is a very good model for the Jewish community outside the land. It's okay to live outside the land, but you have to fight for and support the land of Israel. So I'll leave it on that sermonic note. And yeah, Hannah, go ahead.
I'm wondering if any of the maps in the back could show us what areas we're talking about now.
Yeah, there is a map in the back. Let's just see. Israel in Canaan is what you see. It's mapped. Unfortunately, these things don't have page numbers, but it is the third map. And if you look at it, you'll see, in fact, that the tribe of Manasseh, for example, is on the other side of the Dead Sea, which is where Moab was. Right? So we do have this sense that they are outside the boundaries of what was the land. You're going to see, though, it's not so clear about some of these tribes and what happens to the tribe of Reuben and Gad. They do seem later on to be in the land, but it is clear. And this also, of course, creates all kinds of political questions in terms of the West Bank. And is the West Bank really supposed to be part of Israel, or it's not supposed to be part of Israel? There are a variety of different maps of Israel at different times. At the time of Solomon, for example, it's way, way bigger than it is at other times. There are different descriptions of the land of Israel in different places in the Bible, some quite limited, some quite expansive. There's, so it's very hard when we look at these political questions, contemporary political questions, to kind of ground them in these biblical texts and to say, well, how do we deal with the West Bank? Is this really a part of Israel proper? Is it territory that was acquired through war and therefore, and a defensive war, and therefore Israel's entitled to keep it? One can point to biblical texts in multiple directions around these questions. Any other questions or comments? Yes, Saul. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think this is a commentary. I'm not sure if I'm on the right path or not, but I think I read a commentary where Eleazar was not chosen to lead as opposed to Pinchas because of the fact that the high priest would be committing murder.
He would become ritually impure as a result of committing murder.
Oh.
That's real. That it's not that murder is such a sin, but it's rather that the high priest is not allowed to put himself in a position where he could become ritually impure. So yes and no. Okay, anything else? All right, so have a great week. So I've been thinking about where we're going from here, because we're not that far away from finishing this book. We'll see how close we get. Before Shavuot, I do want to teach the book of Ruth, which is one of the most wonderful books in the Bible. Some of you have heard me teach it before, but I always find new things in it. And it's, of course, read on the holiday of Shavuot. And then we'll see where we are. My intention next year is to continue teaching. I don't know how much of a hiatus I'll take. I'll let you know. And to move on to the next book in the Torah, which is the book of Deuteronomy, which is a remarkable book in many ways. Also, Numbers and Deuteronomy are read in part during the summer, and Deuteronomy in the very beginning of the fall. And so they don't tend to get the attention, right? By the high holidays, we're already back reading Genesis. And so these two books are not nearly as well known as Genesis and Exodus. For example, Leviticus is its own problem because it's really laws about priesthood and tends not to be focused on for that reason. Although, according to the rabbis, the classic Jewish tradition, the curriculum, what is the first book that young children are supposed to study? The book of Leviticus. Very surprising, right? What about Noah and the ark and all that? Of course, young kids will love that. No, Leviticus. Why young children?
Even Genesis. Wow,
No,
that surprises
yes.
me.
It's very surprising, Francesca.
Hello?
It's very surprising. But the classical rabbinic education is largely focused around law, the Talmud. There's this argument that young pure children are pure, and the Leviticus is about purity. There's a variety of reasons which are given. But I also find it extraordinarily surprising, and certainly in the modern world, not a good place to start. Genesis, a much better place to talk to engage the imaginations of young children. Go ahead, Sandy. Last comment.
No, Rabbi, is there a class next week? You said something about you might be going away.
There will be a class next week. I am going away, but I'm returning on Monday. I'm leaving tomorrow, coming back on Monday. So there's no reason. Thank you for asking. no reason.
Wonderful trip.
not-
Have a wonderful trip.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Have a great week,
Yes, have
everybody.
fun.
And we'll see you, God willing, I'll see you next week.
Thank you. Have a great
Very
trip.
much.
Siyah Tova.